Good evening. I'm Yvonne Stapp for Science for the Public, and I welcome you to Contemporary Science Issues and Innovations. Tonight, we consider a problem that has increasingly undermined voter representation over the last couple of decades, the gerrymandering of voter districts. And along with a description of the problem, we learned about new mathematical tools that can help courts identify voting maps that are drawn unfairly. Our guest is Professor Justin Solomon of the Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at MIT. Dr. Solomon is also Principal Investigator for the Geometric Data Processing Group in the Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Lab there. This summer, a multi-university group of mathematicians, including Dr. Solomon, took on the gerrymander issue. The team, known as the Metric Geometry and Gerrymandering Group, has committed to providing tools by which the courts can determine whether a particular gerrymander fairly represents voters or not. This group has gotten a lot of media attention for offering both the clear analysis of the gerrymander problem and a solution. So mathematicians to the rescue. We'll learn about the gerrymander problem and the first group to tackle it and the mathematical solution they've come up with. We're very honored to welcome Justin Solomon. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And if we can start just a little general background. On the screen here, we see the original gerrymander, which was drawn here in Massachusetts, and it's a part of Massachusetts, but we just want to show the audience that it was named for the then governor, Gerry, G-E-R-R-Y, and later was mispronounced. But you'll see that the design there in the back of this lizard-like creature is like the salamander, and therefore that was put together and came up gerrymander, just so you have that reference of where this all started from. So then I'll ask Dr. Solomon, like, what's the problem with a gerrymander just in general?
Right. So to be a little bit more clear, the gerrymandering issue is one of the design of voting districts, right? So every time the census comes out, this process takes place in which we take a map of the United States, or more specifically, map of individual states. They typically don't go across states. And each state gets partitioned into little pieces, and these are voting districts. Okay. So for instance, for in Congress, maybe you have 435 of them.
Yes.
And so gerrymandering as an issue is essentially when somebody tries to design the shape of voting districts to achieve a particular outcome for the vote. Okay. Right? Maybe to cluster people together in a particular way to ensure the outcome that they want.
Okay, so it has, in this country, with the two parties tended to be like in favor of the one over the other and so on. It has gotten really disproportionate in the last couple of decades.
Yeah, that's one of many issues, actually. Yeah. So gerrymandering, and typically we think about it in terms of seeing a funny shape on the map.
Yes.
Is an issue in potentially with political parties choosing their own shapes for their districts. Of course, that's actually in discussion right now in the Supreme Court.
Yes.
It's also a civil rights problem.
Yes.
For example, designing districts that are unfair to different underrepresented minorities, and so on, right?
Yes.
And so, the issue of gerrymandering touches a lot of people in a lot of different ways. And it's largely nonpartisan, right?
Yeah.
And so really the challenge to overcome here is how to design fair standards for making districts, regardless of in a way that's representative of the type of population that you're likely to see.
So that everybody's vote counts,
exactly,
so to speak, and it's certainly probably doable. You had some images of some really weird, really weird designs this way.
Right.
Could you show them to us?
Absolutely. So here we see, for example, District 2 in Austin, right? This is in Texas. And clearly, this is a pretty crazy shape, right? So the black shape here are all the people that get clustered together to vote for a single representative, I think, in the House. Right?
All right.
And so if you show somebody this map and you say, well, is this likely to be a fair voting district? Probably their intuition says no. right? But it's not necessarily the case, right? So for instance, civil rights law tells us that if you have the opportunity to draw a district that maybe gives an underrepresented group a voice, that might actually be preferable, even if the shape is not so good, right? And so issues like that complicate the matter, that it's not clear just from the shape that you have the full story.
Okay, which is why the census is important, right? The periodic census, so that you can figure out where people are. And what about that other weird one with the yellow stripe on it?
Right, so on the right-hand side, we see tract 981501. This is in Massachusetts. So what happens, every 10 years the census comes out, and census data is divided roughly into different types of groupings, right? So there's blocks, block groups, and tracts, tracts being the biggest.
I see.
And typically, although not always, unfortunately, especially in redistricting, there's an exception to every rule. It's very uncommon to take a census block and divide it up. Sometimes census tracts are, but even that, typically your voting districts include either all or nothing with these different units. So really, these are the basic units of data collection for the census. They're not partisan. They're not, designed in any particular way other than just to be small. But these are really the building blocks of districts, right? So to make matters even more complicated in the redistricting process, the census tracts themselves are funny shaped, right? And so if your job is to group these things together into voting districts, and you're looking to get some kind of compact shape, you're starting to run into some pretty heavy mathematical challenges.
That's important because if you think intuitively, well, why don't they just make nice squares or something? But what you're saying is, no, they can't.
Not so simple.
It's just very difficult.
Absolutely.
Which then leads us to the quagmire that ends up in court. And we have had several cases now, and we understand that the justices often feel like this is just too complicated.
Right.
And so we had the Supreme Court justice, the Chief Justice, say this is gobbledygook. It was a sophisticated language. But it really is very difficult for the legal people, is that it, to figure out sometimes whether something's unjust.
Exactly. It's one thing to look at a map and somehow intuit that the shape of a district is unfair. It's a very different thing if I put you on the stand and ask you to testify in very clear language precisely what law you're violating and why, right? And so when we talk about fairness of districting plans, oftentimes the law is either vague or very difficult to implement in a numerical or a quantitative way. And we're relying a lot on people's intuition to determine which districts are fair or not.
So along come the mathematicians. How did mathematicians sort of get into this in the first place? And then we have to look at your equipment, your mathematical equipment. Why would mathematicians be interested in this?
Well, fundamentally, redistricting is a geometry problem, right? At the end of the day, you're given a map of the United States or of an individual state, and your job is to partition that map into individual pieces, right? And typically, you do that by considering a number of criteria, right? There's certainly one guiding principle is that you expect roughly one person to one vote. That maybe you want your districts to be compact, whatever that means, which is a separate issue. Maybe you'd like the districts to be representative, and that can mean a lot of different things to different people, right? Whether that means somehow designing the districts so that the outcome of the vote is representative of the proportion of the people that are there, or whether the shape of the district somehow follows boundaries of city lines and other geographical features that you consider to be sort of significant in the process of drawing shapes on the map. So
it could be a little subjective.
Absolutely. Well, right. And so I think what mathematicians and computer scientists like myself are really trying to study are questions like, what does it mean, given even extremely clear criteria, can you find the best possible districting plan? Or if I give you a plan, can I argue in a qualitative and completely clear fashion that the plan is fair or unfair, right? And so essentially, I think mathematicians are very excited to realize that there are a lot of open mathematical problems with real ramifications for the way that we develop policy and even the outcome of our voting and democratic process in the United States.
Then I'll ask you about the tools that you use in this, and therefore your interest in it, because it would be kind of exciting to look at this.
Absolutely.
But the techniques, some of the techniques that have been used that appear like in articles and so on are alien to most of, like, is it cracking and packing, and there were some others. What can you just give us an idea of what some of that means?
Sure. So packing and cracking are sort of two means by which people can gerrymander. Incidentally, when we use the word gerrymander, it's typically, you think of it as in kind of a negative way, that you're manipulating the shape to get a particular outcome. Right? So the idea of packing and cracking is follows. So let's say that I have a state and I have some minority group, and maybe, unfortunately, you're in a legislature and you're trying to reduce the amount of influence that group has. Then there's sort of two ways that you could go about doing that, right? So if you pack, maybe what you do is you draw a district in such a way that every single member, or as many members as possible, of that one minority group are all in that single district, right? And so in that case, what happens? Well, maybe they win that district, but then essentially you've taken those votes which might have contributed to elections nearby, and you've packed them all into one place.
And minimize the effect,
Then on the opposite extreme, and these are two techniques that can be used in tandem, of course, is the idea of cracking, right? So the idea of cracking is if you have, let's say that you're just voting for one thing, and you have two options, then essentially if you have 49% of your vote, then you didn't win, right? The other group won. Right? And so the idea of cracking is to design your voting districts in a fashion where every district gets 49%, for example, of the group that you're trying to disadvantage. Right? So in that case, what you've done is you cracked their vote among many districts where maybe if you'd drawn the lines differently, they would have gotten a representative of their choice.
Okay.
Right? And see, these are sort of two extremes in the world of redistricting that are sort of techniques that you might use as an adversary to design arguably bad, but certainly unfair plans or non-representative ones.
Right. But at the end of the day, it means that even though you go to the polls and you cast your vote, there are many ways in which that doesn't matter, right?
Well, it doesn't matter is a little strong, but I think
yes,
one thing that we don't quite think about very carefully is that we're in a representative democracy here. And what that means is that votes get kind of rounded off in different ways, right?
That's what, yes.
And so, for instance, there are some cases, just by virtue of the way our voting system works, that make it extremely difficult, even if you have the best of intentions, to pull off, in some sense, a fair vote. So for instance, let's say that my state has 10 representatives, and I have 10% of my state is from a particular underrepresented group. Unfortunately, and let's say furthermore, obviously, mathematicians, we love to make simplifying assumptions, right? And let's say that everybody votes on a single issue, right? We've got single issue voters. So roughly, every district in my state, 10% of the vote in that district gets, contributed to one group, and 90% gets contributed to another. So how many representatives do I get for that group? Well, I get 0. Even though I had 10 districts, I have 10% of my state in a particular group, that outcome is not the one that I got. But if that 10% was uniformly distributed throughout the state, right, those people are just spread out, there's actually no way I could draw the lines and achieve some representation for those folks. Right? And that's what makes talking about this so difficult, right? That we actually don't understand the boundaries, in this case the mathematical boundaries, that determine sort of what plans are possible, right? Which is extremely important when you're saying that a plan is unfair, as opposed to just the best you could do.
All right. So now the situation has sort of gotten off the scales into doing this misrepresentation in many respects. So along come the mathematicians. Do you all see this, looking at these maps, as fundamentally a geometric problem in the first place? I mean, is that the way you look at it, or you just...
That's a great question. So I think it's actually sort of, if you look over the years in the past decades, we're certainly not the first people in the computational or mathematical world to look at gerrymandering. I think the difference, and really what we're trying to emphasize in our effort is a few things. One is that it's purely nonpartisan. And another is that we really want a realistic understanding of the redistricting problem. And what that means, for example, it's very attractive to a person like me who has a PhD in geometry to say, oh, great, so I have a map. I want to divide it into pieces.
Goody,
I want them to be, kind of compact. These are things that we can formalize.
Right.
But the reality is that you have to understand the details of civil rights law, of voting law, of how legislatures work, of how redistricting committees work, to understand the parameters of these mathematical problems in a realistic fashion.
I see.
And so that, I think, or I hope, is really the thrust of our new effort, is to create a realistic understanding in the mathematical community of what problems need to be solved, and simultaneously to help people on the legal side understand why these are really difficult, in some cases open mathematical challenges that need to be addressed before we can come up with totally unambiguous and fair standards.
So this is the motivation behind the Moon-Dushan group that you got started this summer. Is that the idea?
Exactly.
And what was the name of that group
It's
again?
the Metric Geometry and Gerrymandering.
Oh, for
group,
sure.
MGGG.
Okay. I like the MGGG, yes, right. But I understand that that was started out as a workshop, and you have mathematicians, but you have more than mathematicians in there, and with the objective of developing the tools for the legal process to help the legal people out, and in a nonpartisan fashion.
Absolutely. So it's a nonpartisan group that has a couple different thrusts. So one of them is definitely on the research side, which is to understand in clear mathematical, but also in a realistic fashion, the challenges of political redistricting. But we also have efforts in education, for instance. So each of our workshops includes a track for high school teachers and also college instructors to develop material to talk about these kinds of issues with their students.
That's great.
Both in math and in sort of civic-minded classes.
Yes, that's great.
And we also have a track for teaching mathematicians to understand the expert witnessing process and what it would take to actually, for example, testify in a court case and try to argue that a plan is fair or unfair.
This is really fantastic because you're merging the civic side with the, including the legal, and with the mathematical side. Okay, so there you are with your yummy maps and your big issues in front of you. How do you look at this? How do you analyze it? What kinds of tools do you bring in? Did you say they are recent, the tools?
Absolutely. So I'll give my perspective as a computer scientist. And of course, our team includes everybody from theoreticians in metric geometry to people like me who work with computers on a daily basis. So from my perspective, what's really interesting is to understand both the role and the limitations of using a computer in the redistricting process, and also in the process of arguing for or against a districting plan.
I see.
So for instance, computer science has an entire area called complexity theory, which is understanding, if you give me the description of a problem, can I expect a computer to be able to solve it well or efficiently? And one of the things that's very well known about the redistricting problem, and the tiniest bit depressing, is that it's very clearly in the category of problems that are computationally intractable, meaning that you actually wouldn't expect a computer to do very well on redistricting. But then, of course, it's very easy to see that and get kind of discouraged. At the same time, it's not clear that a legislature would do any better on solving these kinds of problems. And so what my group has been trying to understand is, how can you develop a relationship between the humans that are doing the redistricting and probably have good understanding of the interpersonal aspects, the legal aspects, and develop computational tools that can help them. So that's on the positive side. On the slightly more kind of negative, and I don't want to use the word negative side, but maybe on the combat side, if somebody comes up with a districting plan, for instance, when the 2020 census comes out, all of a sudden, these lines are going to be drawn, and we have to give people an arsenal of tools to argue for or against a plan. And that in itself is actually an open challenge. So for instance, in many places, the existence of a better plan is not in itself a way to argue against a plan. In other words, you don't have to make the best possible one. You just have to make one that follows the rules. So that kind of rules out the most obvious argument you might make. And we know that redistricting is NP hard. It's intractable. So it's very easy for legislature to go in front of the court and say, well, that's the best we could do, and this is a hard problem. So one of the things that we're exploring right now, and this includes with collaborators like Wendy Cho in Illinois and Joey Chen, is the idea of randomly sampling districting plans. So for instance, maybe I have a supercomputer, and the supercomputer's job in life is just to draw not just one districting plan, but millions or billions of them, all that follow the rules. And now I look at all of those millions of plans, and I measure, for example, some measure of fairness, compactness, whatever is desirable. Right? And so then I can create a plot, right? I can say, okay, I'm going to make a little dot for every single one of the plans that my computer generated that shows, for example, how proportional my vote was. And then I can put an X on that plot, which is maybe the plan that my legislature came up with. And typically what will happen in a lot of these experiments is that X will be very far away from all the dots that you got when your computer sampled, in the space of all these, plans that followed the rules. So this is a really interesting idea because it gives you some notion of intent, right? What it tells you is that it would be very unlikely that your legislature just accidentally made this unfair plan, right? And so we're exploring this idea as one potential sort of tool in the set of weapons that you could use to argue against a plan which, sure, looks unfair, but that's not enough. You need a qualitative, clear argument for why that is either worse than every possible alternative, or was designed with intent by the legislature to create an unfair outcome to a given minority or a group of interest.
But what if I hear this correctly now, what you've got on offer or in development is certainly is that you can present to the courts this would look really bad. I mean, this doesn't work, and I can back that up with this.
And not only does this not work, but even if you just randomly drew a plan, you would do better than the one the legislature came up with.
But there's an objectivity about that. Now, the other thing is, if I may understand this, is it seems to me like this is a very powerful computational thing. Is that true, and is that part of the reason why it's new, or is it the technique that's new, or both?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, essentially, advances in computer equipment are one of the big reasons why we're revisiting a lot of these challenges. Right? So for instance, just in that project I mentioned to you, if I want to generate millions of districting plans, I better have a really good computer that can do that fast and in a fair way. Right? Like if I generate districting plans by drawing the lines to favor my own group, then of course I'm going to have my own bias.
Exactly.
So yeah, absolutely. The role of computers here, in particular, being able to carry out millions of computations per second is really critical for exploring the space of ways that you could partition the map in an efficient fashion. So again, I keep kind of going back to there being positive and negative way to tell the story. The negative way would be this is a quick way to, or hopefully we can develop quick ways to explore this space and show that what a legislature came up with was unfair and unlikely. But then on the positive side, it could be that redistricting really is a big challenge, and these computational tools can be used to reveal plans that might not have otherwise been obvious.
So you could present, here are some designs that will be fair, that will be representative, and it's nonpartisan. There it is.
And so that's
fabulous.
Seeing the beginning of computers helping there. So for instance, there's an open source project called District Builder, which I encourage people to take a look at. It's a really powerful tool, where essentially it can help draw a map, get different measures of compactness and fairness, and just show you as you're drawing these plans what the properties are.
I could just see like students would love playing with that too.
So one of our friends of the MGGG is a gentleman named Mike McDonald in Florida, who studies redistricting competitions, for example. Like maybe I put the map out to all of my friends and I ask them to all draw plans, and this is one way to both involve everybody in the
There you are,
procedure
right.
and to just reveal different things that you might not have seen if you're one redistricting
They don't,
committee.
with that particular program, they wouldn't necessarily have to be a computer scientist, whereas that they don't have to be a professional.
Right.
They need to be able to put in the data,
Exactly.
and then the computer will do the work for you.
Exactly. So maybe the engineers
neat.
at the legislature are the ones that load in
Yes.
the data, and then your job is really just to draw,
Yeah.
partitions on a map.
This just sounds incredibly
It's really
promising,
exciting.
very interesting,
Yeah.
very interesting. And so, with the upcoming census, do you anticipate going to legislatures or going to courts and being able to say now that here's the plan? I mean, here are the designs that work.
Absolutely. So I mean, I
Great.
think really our plan is which is uncommon in the mathematical world.
Yeah,
We have
yeah.
a deadline, right? If we're trying to prove a theorem, we've got all the time
Yeah,
in the world.
yeah.
But here, by the time the 2020 census comes out and the redistricting starts to happen again, our goal is to come up with tools for helping people redistrict and for helping people fight against plans that are unfair.
Yes, and in the meantime, even leading up to that, would you have enough to be able, like the Wisconsin, the Pennsylvania, the North
There's so many
Carolina,
different
these
cases
cases that have been brought to the courts now, and the Supreme Court looking at this, I guess with the Wisconsin one, that you can say, you have something, look, we can show you whether something is really fair or unfair yet.
Potentially, and in fact, one of the big points of discussion right now among mathematicians is what is the right measure of fairness?
Yeah, well,
right? And this is a big issue, right?
Yes.
So if you look, for example, there's this efficiency gap measure which appears
Yeah.
in the recent Supreme Court case. And if you just poke at it mathematically, you can see it has certain properties that are either positive or negative. So
I
might,
see.
in fact, my colleague Moon, one of the other members
Yeah.
of MGGG, has something with Mira Bernstein in the notices of the AMS, that's the American Mathematical Society. And essentially this is a publication that's just exploring mathematically what does this thing measure and what kinds of districts does it prefer.
yes.
Right? So absolutely, in tandem with all of these computational efforts, we also have to develop mathematical measures of fairness,
Yeah.
of compactness of
Yes.
the shape of your
Yeah,
district.
yeah,
Right? There are
right,
different
right,
measures
right,
of that, and,
right,
they
right.
measure different things.
Right.
Of whether you're preserving communities of interest is a legal term that appears a lot in
Yeah.
that space.
Yes. Right.
All of these things are important, and different measures have different properties that might be positive or negative.
Yes, it sounds as though it might be dynamic also rather than just a static kind of
Absolutely.
that population changes, the representation, the issues and all of that change, but you can accommodate that with
Exactly.
this
I
general
think there's
plan.
a
That is
baseline
neat.
amount of fairness, and then
Yeah,
there are a
right.
lot of considerations that depend on your state, on your legislature, where you are, who you're working
Right,
with,
right.
and a realistic picture rather than just like mathematicians walking in,
Yes,
proving a
right.
theorem about something kind of adjacent to what you're
Yes.
doing and leaving, is really to work
Yeah,
with the people
yes.
that are doing
and,
this.
And that is
And,
one of the most promising things, so I'll make sure we
Exactly.
put plenty of information about this group. Now, do you, in your group at MIT, are you also working on the same thing, or is this only the MGGG group that's working?
Right. Well, we're hoping to work on this among many other problems in
Yeah.
geometry. So our group, my group is the Geometric Data Processing Group in CSAIL at MIT. And we study all kinds of problems involving geometric data. So this includes, census data and GIS, like
I see.
geographic information systems. In addition, like for instance, I used to work at an animation studio. We have computer graphics collaborators in the medical imaging world. It's a very diverse set of students. So we're certainly hoping to explore this more broadly. My own contributions to MGGG, as well as if funding is always a challenge for research groups.
Especially,
But if
yes,
we can
right.
identify some to hire researchers to study
Right.
the gerrymandering problem, I think the consensus among not just members of our group, but the mathematical community more broadly is
Yeah.
that there's more unknowns than knowns at this point.
Yes.
And they're worthy of nonpartisan, unbiased
Exactly.
mathematical study.
Yes, right, right. That's really a very exciting development. You really, and commitment behind it is being nonpartisan, trying to be fair to all, and involving all kinds of people and reaching out to the public. It's just a spectacular move. Thank you. I'm hoping that you inspire everybody. Before we close, you do a whole bunch of things, and I asked if you would just sort of casually mention a few of the things. You have very broad interests and talents. Would you, as an inspiration to young people everywhere, because we usually think of people in math or computer science as being, whatever it is, their field, it's extremely narrow. And this seems to be giving way now to more comprehensive approaches to things. Would you please tell us some of the exciting things that you do?
Oh gosh,
Only
I
the
don't know.
exciting
Yeah, not too exciting. Well, I'm an avid, if not very high quality musician, and I spend a lot of time playing cello and piano, and like to cook, all that kind of stuff.
Oh, good,
but,
good.
I think it's important to have a lot of hobbies, and
Yes,
often these inform what you're doing.
And in terms, I'm sure that is very good relief. And it's amazing how many people in math, but in science generally, are musicians.
Oh,
it's just
absolutely.
amazing.
Yeah.
And I think at CERN they had like 3 orchestras.
Oh, yeah.
Just amazing.
One of the things that really struck me when I moved to the Boston area was just
the music
number of
community.
community groups and
Yes.
the quality and the level
yes.
of competitiveness.
Yes,
yes.
yes.
Somehow they have. When I moved here, I contacted all these different community symphonies and just to schedule an audition. And a lot of them said, "Sorry, we just have too many cellists. We don't know what to do." And I've never, in my career, been in a place where a community group was in that position.
But this is a very musical community.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. In terms of your work, in the computer science, I meant in that all of your CSAIL, the CSAIL, GSAIL, whatever, all of that, all that stuff. Can you give us a hint of some of the other things that you get engaged in before we close down?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So our research group studies geometric data.
Yeah.
And so to me, this idea of geometric data processing has kind of 2 meanings. One of them is the processing of geometric data. So for instance, if I'm a self-driving car or a robot and I have some sensor that's collecting information about the shapes around me, then one of the big problems that we study is all about how can you carry out inference and understanding on that data, right? Can I recognize the objects around me and use that information to inform how I interact with the world? And then the other hand, we talk about geometric data processing, which involves geometric techniques, like what we might learn about in geometry class in high school, applied to very abstract data sets. So like, can we find geometric structure in data like your social network? And what can we, how can we leverage that to come up with interesting information that might not be so obvious?
Right.
So hiding inside of this research is really exciting for me because we deal with everything from the low-level kind of mathematical ideas, from differential geometry, from numerical analysis, which is where my textbook is from, all the way to high-level things like understanding whether it's gerrymandering or point clouds coming in from a LiDAR scanner to your self-driving car.
Yes.
And so we have students with this huge variety of background in our group, and it's a really exciting time to be in a group like ours.
It does sound like it's an exciting time because the tools are getting better and better for one thing, and a lot of people are interested in a more multidimensional approach to things. Maybe
Absolutely.
It's gotten away from that very narrow approach in academia, but the other is that there's so much happening. There's so many innovations right now.
Exactly.
It must be heaven to be around.
Oh, it's ridiculously exciting, and we're in one of these really fun areas. It's at the confluence of mathematics, of computation, and of really working closely with our collaborators in industry and different applications. And that's really what gets, I think, a lot of the members of our lab excited.
Yes. Well, I'm sure that lab is going to be very famous for many years and so on. I wish you all of the best. I thank you for giving us your time and explaining this thing. And I hope we'll talk to you again about some of your other work, which is all very exciting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.